The shopping mall thrummed like a living thing, a cavernous giant, its breath heavy with the scent of fried food and stale perfume. Under the sterile glow of fluorescent lights, people moved in restless streams, their faces hollow, their eyes glazed, each chasing their own purpose without ever seeing the others they brushed past. At the far end of the food court, dwarfed by the towering advertisements and polished glass walls, a boy limped forward on a pair of battered crutches. His movements were careful, deliberate, each step a quiet battle against gravity and exhaustion. A tiny kitten, no bigger than a loaf of bread, nestled inside the pouch of his hoodie, its wide eyes flicking anxiously at the passing crowds. Jason didn't come here to cause trouble. He didn't come for attention. He came because the outside world felt too loud, too cold, too full of dangers he couldn't outrun. Here, among the bland smiles and artificial laughter, he thought he could vanish. Just another invisible figure swallowed up by the endless tide of shoppers. But some people, Jason knew too well, saw things differently. Some didn't look at him and see a boy. They saw a question, a risk, a threat. From across the court, a uniformed mall guard watched him with a gaze sharp enough to cut. Heavy boots clicking on the tile, the guard began to move, cutting a path through the crowd with the slow, deliberate inevitability of a hunting animal. Jason's heart thudded harder, a sick, familiar rhythm. He lowered his eyes, tightening his grip on the crutches, trying to melt into the background. It never worked. Not for him. The guard's shadow fell over him like a storm cloud. "Hey!" the man barked, voice carrying across the din, loud enough to make a few heads turn. "What do you think you're doing here?" Jason looked up, throat dry, trying to summon words that might de-escalate. Words he had used before, in other places, to other uniforms. Before he could answer, before he could even shift his weight to face him properly, the guard's hand shot out, swift, practiced, and with a vicious snap, knocked one of Jason's crutches out from under him. The world tilted violently. The kitten let out a shrill, terrified squeal as Jason crumpled, twisting, unable to catch himself. His body hit the ground hard, pain flaring through his side, and a gasp shuddered through the nearby crowd. No one moved. Above him, the guard stood, sneering down with cold satisfaction. The crutch skittered across the floor. The kitten, trembling, tried to crawl toward Jason, mewling pitifully. The guard lifted his heavy boot, and before Jason could cry out, could plead, could shield the tiny creature, the boot came down. The sickening thud of the boot striking the kitten's tiny body echoed louder in Jason's mind than the roar of the entire mall. The little creature tumbled, limp, across the gleaming floor, its cries silenced, as if the life had been stomped out of it in one brutal instant. Jason scrambled toward it, dragging himself with his arms, but the guard shoved him back with a rough hand to his chest, forcing him to the cold, sticky tile. "Stay down, boy!" The guard snarled, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, his words dripping with venom, turning the term into something filthy, something meant to slice. Jason could feel the eyes on him now, not with sympathy, but with suspicion, with thinly veiled contempt, as if his mere presence here had justified this violence. Someone muttered, "They're always causing trouble." And another voice, older, dismissive, said, "Look what happens when you let them into decent places." Jason's heart pounded harder, his face burning with humiliation, but he forced himself to raise his head to meet the cold, satisfied glare of the guard towering over him. A low chuckle rumbled from somewhere in the crowd, and Jason realized with a sick, hollow feeling that they weren't just indifferent. Some were enjoying this. The guard leaned closer, lowering his voice to a sharp whisper meant only for Jason. "People like you don't belong here. You scare the real customers away." The words sliced deeper than any shove or kick, and Jason clenched his fists against the floor, trembling with rage and helplessness. His crutches lay yards away, useless. His kitten lay even farther, unmoving, a small, broken shape against the sterile brightness of the mall floor. The guard straightened up and glanced around, noticing the growing attention. His smile twisted into a sneer as he barked, "Someone call security backup. Got a situation with a vagrant." Jason tried to speak, to say he wasn't a vagrant, he wasn't a threat, he was just a boy with a kitten looking for a quiet place to rest, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was thick with shame. A woman nearby, clutching her designer purse to her chest, shook her head in disgust. "Probably stealing," she said under her breath, not even bothering to lower her voice enough that Jason wouldn't hear. Another man, arms folded across a beer belly, nodded approvingly. "Finally doing something about them," he said, and Jason realized he had become a spectacle, a show for their spite and fear. And in that moment, pinned to the cold floor under the weight of their hatred, Jason understood something brutal and permanent. It was never about what he did. It was about what he looked like. And no apology, no obedience would ever change that. The mall security office smelled like old coffee, sweat, and the mechanical tang of cheap cleaning supplies. But Jason barely noticed as he was half dragged, half carried inside by two guards who treated him like something dirty, clinging to their hands. The kitten was gone. He hadn't seen where they took it, or if they even bothered to. And every step he was pulled forward made the pain in his ribs flare white hot. The guards dropped him onto a hard plastic chair like he was a sack of garbage, one of them laughing under his breath as Jason struggled to sit up, his legs weak and trembling without his crutches. The main guard, the one who had attacked him, stood nearby with arms crossed and an expression that wasn't anger or even authority. It was satisfaction, as if the events of the last few minutes had scratched some deep itch inside him. Jason tried to speak, to explain, but before he could get a word out, another guard, a younger man with a shaved head and a permanent smirk, leaned down so close Jason could smell his breath. "You people think you can just walk in here like you belong," he hissed, his tone dripping with scorn. "You think you're untouchable because everyone's scared of getting called racist. Guess what, kid? Not today." Jason flinched as the man snapped his fingers an inch from his face, like trying to spook an animal. Another guard chuckled darkly, flipping open a binder thick with mall policy papers that no one seemed interested in actually following. Jason swallowed hard, trying to push down the rage bubbling inside him, but it was hard when every second pressed the weight of their hate deeper into his chest. They made a show of patting him down, searching his hoodie, even though they had no reason, no authority. And when they found nothing but a few crumpled dollars and a worn bus pass, the lead guard just shook his head and laughed low in his throat, the sound full of mocking disappointment, like he had expected nothing better. "Figures," he muttered. "Doesn't even have enough to steal anything worth it." Jason sat there, burning inside, as they rifled through his few belongings, held up his cracked phone like it was contraband, made jokes he wasn't supposed to hear about what kids from the projects probably had hidden on them. They didn't say the words outright. They didn't have to. Every look, every touch, every sneering word was soaked in it. Black, poor, worthless. The three things they had decided about him before he even opened his mouth. A woman entered the room, a mall manager, sharp-heeled and sharp-eyed, her blonde hair scraped back into a perfect knot, and she gave Jason one glance, just one, before her lip curled ever so slightly. She didn't see a child. She saw a problem. "What's the situation?" she asked briskly, flipping open a tablet. The lead guard stepped forward eagerly, recounting a version of events so twisted Jason almost didn't recognize it. Caught him loitering near the stores, acting suspicious. Refused orders to move along. Became aggressive when confronted. Endangered shoppers. Possible shoplifting attempt. Jason opened his mouth to protest, but the manager silenced him with a look so cold it froze the words in his throat. She didn't want to hear his side. She had heard enough from the ones who mattered. "Security footage?" she asked. "We have some from the food court, but he was out of frame most of the time," the guard said, not even trying to hide the lie. Jason realized in horror that they weren't interested in evidence. They were building a story people like her were all too willing to believe. "I recommend a permanent trespass order," the lead guard continued, his voice smug, "and contacting local law enforcement. Make sure he learns he's not welcome." The manager nodded without hesitation. Jason, shaking, forced himself to his feet, pain slicing through his side. "Please," he said, his voice ragged and desperate. "I didn't do anything. I just needed somewhere to sit. My cat." The guards laughed openly now. "Your cat?" the younger one mocked, putting heavy, sarcastic air quotes around the word. "Oh no, folks, he had a cat. Lock us up, we're the bad guys." Jason's hands balled into fists at his sides, and for one terrifying second, he thought he might swing, might do something reckless, something they could really destroy him for. But he didn't. He couldn't. Because even here, even after everything, he knew the rules. If he fought back, if he so much as twitched wrong, he wouldn't just be humiliated, he would be crushed. The mall manager turned to him, her voice clipped and professional, the way you might speak to a piece of garbage stuck to your shoe. You are hereby banned from the premises, permanently. Any attempt to re-enter will be considered trespassing. Do you understand? Jason nodded, barely able to keep his balance without his crutches. One of the guards shoved a piece of paper into his hand. A formal notice, full of official-sounding language that meant nothing except that he was unwanted, untrusted, and marked. They hauled him to the back entrance, through dim, grimy hallways that smelled of wet cardboard and old grease, pushing him out into the alley without so much as returning his crutches. He stumbled, catching himself painfully against the wall, his vision blurring with unshed tears. The door slammed shut behind him, the heavy metal thunk of finality. Alone, cold, broken, Jason slid down the wall into the dirt. He didn't know where the kitten was. He didn't know how he was going to get home. He didn't even know if he could get home. The sky above was an iron grey, the wind slicing through his torn clothes. And as he sat there, shivering, the weight of everything crashed down on him. It wasn't just a bad day. It wasn't just one cruel guard. It was the whole system, a system that had decided before he ever spoke that he was lesser, dangerous, disposable. Jason closed his eyes, gripping the crumpled trespass notice in his bloody fingers. And somewhere deep inside him, something snapped. Not the anger, not the sadness, but the last fragile thread of trust he had clung to for so long. Whatever world the people inside that mall belonged to, it wasn't his. It never had been. Before we continue with the next chapter, let's take a brief pause. We would love to hear from you. Please share in the comments where you're listening to our story from, and if you've ever experienced anything similar in your own life. Feel free to subscribe for more chapters as the story unfolds. Now, let's pick up where we left off. The next morning, Jason woke up on the cold pavement behind the mall, the chill of the concrete seeping into his bones. The city was waking up too, the distant hum of traffic, the rush of voices as people hurried about their lives. Lives that had nothing to do with him. His ribs ached, his side felt raw, and his heart was heavy with the weight of what had happened. He had no crutches, no kitten, no place to go. His phone was gone too, and with it, any hope of finding someone who might help. The world felt vast and indifferent, and he was just a speck in it. He pushed himself to his feet, wincing with every movement. The streets around him were starting to fill with people, but no one looked at him, no one offered to help. He was invisible as they had made him feel last night, as invisible as they wanted him to stay. Jason stumbled forward, his thoughts jumbled. He couldn't get the images of the mall out of his mind. The guards' faces twisted in contempt, the cruel laughter, the humiliation. He had been thrown out like trash, discarded in the alley like he didn't matter, like nothing about him mattered. And then there was the kitten. He hadn't seen where it had gone. He didn't know if it was still alive. He didn't know if anyone cared. That thought gnawed at him, sharper than any physical pain. But there was no time to dwell on it. He had to move, had to figure out what to do next. As he walked, his thoughts turned to the people in the mall, the ones who had stood by, who had watched it all happen and said nothing, the ones who had made it clear with their glances, with their whispers, with their lack of action that he didn't belong. It was then that he heard the first shout. "Hey, you!" Jason froze, his heart racing. He didn't recognize the voice, but it was angry, cutting through the morning air like a blade. "Yeah, you, kid. What are you doing out here? Don't you know this is private property?" Jason turned, and a man in a security uniform was storming toward him, his eyes wide with suspicion. This wasn't the same guard from yesterday. This one was older, his face scruffy with a few days of stubble, but his posture was just as threatening. "Get over here," the man shouted. Jason stood frozen, his legs like lead. He wanted to run, to get away from whatever this man was going to do. But something stopped him. Something made him want to stand his ground, even if it was pointless. The man stopped a few feet away from him, his eyes narrowing. "What the hell's your problem?" he spat, looking Jason up and down like he was something vile, something worth spitting on. Jason opened his mouth to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. He could already feel the weight of his own race pressing down on him, suffocating him. The man didn't wait for an answer. "You think you can just show up around here and cause trouble? You think the world owes you something?" He took a step closer, and Jason took an involuntary step back. "Well, it doesn't. You don't belong here. You never did." The man's voice was thick with venom, his words full of contempt. Jason could feel his hands shaking, his heart pounding, but he stood still, tried to keep his breath steady. He had to keep it together. The man reached out suddenly, grabbing Jason by the arm, pulling him closer. "I think you better leave before I call the cops," he growled. Jason's stomach twisted with a mix of fear and anger. The cops. He couldn't go through that again. He didn't want to end up in some holding cell, accused of something he didn't do. He pulled his arm free, almost falling over as he stumbled back. "Get off me," he muttered, but the man wasn't finished. He stepped forward again, his eyes blazing with rage. "What did you say to me, boy?" Jason's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the words hovering on the edge of his lips, the words that would make everything worse. "I said, get off me," he repeated, louder this time, his voice trembling. But the man wasn't listening. He lunged at him again, this time grabbing him by the collar and slamming him into the side of a dumpster. Jason's vision blurred with pain, and for a moment he thought he might pass out. He couldn't even fight back. There was no energy left in him to fight. There was no one to help him. "You think you can talk back to me?" the man spat, his face inches from Jason's. "You think you're some kind of tough guy? You're nothing. You're a nobody." Jason closed his eyes, trying to block out the words, trying to block out the hate. But it was all around him. It was in the man's voice. It was in the way the people who had walked by before wouldn't even look at him now. It was in the way they all saw him, as nothing. He was nothing to them. No one cared. No one would care. And then, in the distance, he heard something. Voices. The murmur of people gathering, a few of them laughing, a few of them shouting. Jason didn't want to look, didn't want to see, but he couldn't help it. His eyes shifted toward the street corner, and there, on the sidewalk, was a group of people, a small crowd, gathered around, filming something with their phones. Jason's breath caught in his chest. He recognized one of them. A girl he had passed yesterday, standing in line at a fast food place inside the mall. She was one of the ones who had looked at him like he was a problem, like he didn't belong. And now she was filming, capturing every second of his humiliation for an audience. It wasn't enough that he had been humiliated by the guards, by the people who worked at the mall, by the city itself. Now he was going to be humiliated by the world. Jason's face burned with shame, and for a moment, everything went black. He didn't know what he was going to do. He didn't know what to say. But then, before he could sink into the suffocating weight of it all, he heard another voice. Different this time. Stronger. "Hey!" It was a woman's voice, loud and sharp. "What the hell is going on here?" The crowd parted, and the woman strode forward, pushing past the man who had been holding Jason. She was tall, her face set with an expression of quiet fury. "What's wrong with you?" "Let him go." The man hesitated, looking at her like she was the one who didn't belong. But the woman didn't wait for him to respond. "I said, let him go." And this time, something in her voice, in the way she stood her ground, made him back off. He stepped back, grumbling under his breath, but he didn't touch Jason again. The woman looked down at Jason, her eyes softening. And for the first time in what felt like forever, someone looked at him with something other than contempt. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice low, concerned. Jason swallowed, not trusting his voice, but he nodded. The crowd had dispersed, but the damage was done. The world had seen him. The world had already made up its mind. And nothing could change that. Not now. Not ever. The woman who had intervened didn't say much after the confrontation. She offered him a brief glance, a gesture that might have meant something. Concern, sympathy, maybe even a shred of decency. But in the harsh light of everything that had happened, it was meaningless. Jason could feel the sting of the crowd's gaze lingering on him, even as they walked away, phones still out, still recording every awkward step he took. His body trembled from the humiliation, his heart heavy with the weight of rejection and cruelty. There was no kindness here, no sense of relief, just another chapter in a story he couldn't escape. The woman didn't wait for him to respond. She simply turned on her heel and walked off, blending back into the world that had left him behind. Jason watched her go, his throat tight, the harsh realization gnawing at him. She wasn't any different from the others. She had done nothing to stop the torment. All she did was make a show of pretending to care, just like the rest. As he stumbled away from the street corner, the feeling of invisibility grew even more suffocating. He thought he had been seen, thought he had been heard, but no. The world didn't care. The crowd had disappeared, the recording had been posted, and soon enough, everything would go back to normal. Everything except him. The wind picked up, biting at his skin, but Jason didn't have the energy to care. He was numb, his body sore from the night before, and his mind reeling from the series of events that had led him here. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know how to fix it. The city sprawled out before him, a cold, indifferent landscape. But he knew he didn't belong here. He didn't belong anywhere. He had nothing. His thoughts were interrupted by the sharp vibration of a phone in his pocket. His hands were shaking, but he fumbled for it, desperate for anything to distract him from the thoughts swirling in his head. The screen lit up, and his breath caught in his throat when he saw the notification. Video of yesterday's incident goes viral. Watch now. He didn't want to look. He didn't want to see it. The cruel laughter, the sneers, the cold indifference. He already knew what it would show. The man in the security uniform, the angry words, the brutal dismissal, his fall to the ground, his humiliation. He was already broken. But seeing it again, seeing the entire world watch him be torn apart, would be the final nail. But his finger moved anyway. He tapped the notification. The video played, grainy footage with the shaky, amateur feel of someone trying to capture a moment of cruelty. He could see it, the guard looming over him, the way the people in the background laughed, the way they stood still, passive observers of something so ugly. His own voice sounded distant and small, drowned out by the laughter and the shouting. He couldn't even recognize himself in it. The kid in the video wasn't him. The person who had fallen, who had begged for mercy, was someone else. But it was his face. It was his body, his crutches, his humiliation. The video had been shared by hundreds, thousands. The comments were endless. Typical. He should have known better than to show up. All they do is cause problems. Should have been kicked out sooner. Can't believe they let people like that in public. Each word, each sentence, each sneer was a blade, carving deeper into his soul. He wanted to scream, to throw the phone into the street and shatter it, but he couldn't. He was stuck, frozen, unable to escape from the prison of his own image, his own fate. There was no way to make it stop. His mind raced, trying to think of something, anything, that would bring him back from the edge. But all he could see, all he could feel, was the wall of hate that had built up around him, brick by brick, until there was no escape. He had nothing left. No crutches, no kitten, no dignity. His world had collapsed, and all because of what he looked like. The shame was unbearable. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. He wanted to run, to get away from it all. But there was nowhere to go. There was no way to hide. A voice in his head told him that it would be easier if he just disappeared, if he just left, if he never had to face the world again. The world wasn't kind to people like him. People who weren't supposed to be here. People who didn't belong. As he walked through the streets, the world felt even colder, even more alien. Every glance, every passing car, every shadow seemed to whisper the same message. You don't belong here. He tried to block it out, to focus on something, anything, that would take him away from the crushing weight of the world. But his thoughts kept spiraling back to the video, the comments, the cruel words that would follow him for the rest of his life. He wanted to scream, He wanted to break something, anything, to escape from the silence that was swallowing him whole. He wanted to punch the walls, tear down the street signs, burn the buildings, anything to feel like he existed outside of their gaze. But even that felt pointless. The anger wasn't enough. The rage wasn't enough. It never was. And in the quiet moments between his angry thoughts, the gnawing fear started to take over. What if I never get out of this? What if they are right? What if I'm not meant to be here? As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the empty street, Jason realized something. The world wasn't just against him. It wasn't just the guards, or the people in the mall, or the ones who shared the video. It was the system. It was the way things had always been, the way things were always going to be. He wasn't a person to them. He wasn't a kid. He wasn't even human. He was just an inconvenience, a problem, something to be dealt with. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise, a shout followed by laughter. Jason turned, his heart hammering in his chest. It was a group of teenagers, no older than him, standing on the corner of the street. They were laughing, pointing at him, talking in loud voices that made it impossible to ignore them. "Yo, check this out," one of them said, pulling out a phone. "This is the kid from the video." The others erupted into cruel laughter. "Yo, man, you look pathetic. What are you doing out here? Crying over your kitten? You got kicked out of the mall, huh? Don't come around here anymore. You're not welcome." Jason stood frozen, the words slicing through him like a knife. He wanted to leave. He wanted to run. But his legs wouldn't move. He just stood there, feeling every ounce of his dignity erode with each laugh, each sneer. There was no escape, and as they walked off, leaving him standing there, Jason felt the last piece of himself break away. The world had already made its judgment, and it wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. The days that followed felt like a blur, each one blending into the next with the dull, relentless ache of despair. Jason drifted through the city, moving like a shadow in the crowds, never stopping, never looking anyone in the eye. He avoided the mall, avoided the streets where he knew people had seen him, heard his name, whispered their judgments. Every step felt like an echo of the video that had spread through the internet. The clip that made him a spectacle, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world. His phone had been dead for days, but he couldn't bring himself to charge it. He didn't want to see the comments, didn't want to hear their voices, mocking him, taunting him. He knew it was all over by now. The whole city knew who he was, and the whole city had made it clear that he was nothing more than a problem to be dealt with, an inconvenience that needed to be removed. People weren't afraid to show it anymore. They didn't hide behind smiles or polite indifference. They made it known. He was walking down the street one afternoon when a group of teenagers passed by, laughing loudly. They didn't look at him, but their words still cut through the air like knives. "That kid from the video," one of them said, snickering. "What's he doing out here? Should have stayed out of the mall. You know, like he belongs on the streets where people like him go." Jason's stomach turned, but he kept walking. He didn't stop, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him flinch. He couldn't. He wouldn't. But the words followed him anyway. They always did. At night, he'd find himself alone in the dark, replaying everything in his head, trying to understand how it had all spiraled so far out of control. Why had the guard treated him like that? Why had they all treated him like that? What had he done to deserve it? The city didn't answer, of course. No one did. He was just a boy, lost in the middle of a world that didn't want him, a world that saw his skin and saw only one thing: a threat. It was late one evening when Jason found himself standing in front of a rundown community center. It wasn't much, just a small, dilapidated building tucked away at the edge of the neighborhood. But it was a place that had always felt like a sanctuary. He had passed by it countless times, but tonight, something pulled him inside. Inside, the walls were cracked and peeling, the lights flickering like they were on their last legs. But there was a sense of warmth here, a sense of something real. A group of people were gathered in the corner, talking quietly, their voices low, but filled with a kind of purpose Jason hadn't heard in a long time. His feet carried him to the door, and he hesitated for just a moment before stepping inside. The moment he did, A man sitting at a desk looked up, his eyes scanning Jason with quiet suspicion. But there was no contempt in his gaze. No judgment, just curiosity. "Can I help you, son?" the man asked, his voice deep, steady. Jason opened his mouth, but for the first time in a long time, the words didn't come. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what he was looking for. But the man didn't push him. Instead, he gestured to an empty seat. "Come on in. We're just talking. You look like you could use a place to sit." And Jason, without thinking, sat down. The room was filled with a quiet energy, an energy that seemed to understand something about him that no one else did. The people here didn't care about the video. They didn't care about the color of his skin or the way the world had treated him. They didn't see him as an inconvenience. They saw him as a person, as someone who had been hurt, someone who was lost. And for the first time in days, Jason felt something he had almost forgotten existed: hope. It wasn't much. It wasn't a cure for everything that had happened, but it was something. The man at the desk, who introduced himself as Marcus, spoke about the community, about how people came here when they had nowhere else to go, when the world outside had turned its back on them. "This is a place for people who've been forgotten," Marcus said, his voice steady, full of conviction. "We're not about judging, not about pointing fingers. We're about helping each other stand up when the world wants to keep us down." Jason listened, but something inside him was still raw, still aching. He wanted to believe Marcus, wanted to believe that things could get better, but the scars from the past few days were still too fresh, too painful. "I don't belong here," Jason muttered, almost to himself. "I don't belong anywhere." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He just sat there for a moment, watching Jason, as if he could see right through him. Then, slowly, he spoke. "I've been where you are, son. I felt like I didn't belong, like the world was against me. But let me tell you something. The world doesn't get to decide where you fit. You decide that. You decide where you go, who you become." Jason looked up at Marcus, his eyes tired, his heart heavy. "But what if the world doesn't let me? What if the world only sees what it wants to see?" Marcus's expression softened. "The world sees what it wants to see, yeah. But that doesn't mean it gets to define you. You're not just what they say you are. You're not just the kid in the video. You're more than that. You have to remember that." Jason wanted to believe him. He wanted to believe that there was a way out of this, that there was something more for him than being a symbol of hate, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world. But the truth was, every step he took, every person he saw, every comment he heard, reminded him that he was a target, that he was nothing more than an object of ridicule, an outsider who didn't fit. "I don't know if I can do it," Jason said, his voice quiet, defeated. "I don't know how to stop being what they see me as." Marcus leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You take it one step at a time. You don't have to change everything overnight, but you have to start by believing in yourself. And you have to remember this. The world may try to break you down, but it doesn't have the power to decide who you are. Only you do." Jason sat in silence, the weight of Marcus's words settling over him. It wasn't a promise, it wasn't a guarantee, but for the first time in days, he felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. The road ahead was still unclear, still filled with obstacles, but for the first time, Jason realized that he wasn't alone in this fight. There were people who saw him, who understood him, and he wasn't going to let the world define him. Not anymore. The next morning, as he walked out into the harsh light of the day, Jason didn't feel quite so small. He didn't feel invisible. There was still a long road ahead of him, but at least now he was walking with a little more strength, a little more resolve. The world might never see him the way he wanted it to, but he would never stop fighting to show them who he really was. The first few days after his meeting with Marcus were a blur. Jason spent most of his time thinking about what Marcus had said, trying to hold on to those words as if they were a lifeline in the storm of his life. You decide who you are. It wasn't easy. The pain, the humiliation, the relentless weight of the world pushing down on him, they didn't go away. But something had shifted, ever so slightly inside him. A flicker of hope, a flicker of possibility. That small spark of belief, that maybe he could be more than the sum of what everyone else thought he was, kept him going. He returned to the community center every day, sitting quietly in the corner as Marcus and the others spoke about the struggles they had faced. They didn't offer simple answers or false promises. They didn't tell him that everything would be okay. They told him that it was okay to not be okay, that it was okay to feel lost, to feel angry. That was something Jason wasn't used to. The world had told him that he should be ashamed of his anger, ashamed of the rage that bubbled inside him. But here, in this place, anger was just a part of the process. It was part of healing, part of fighting back. Still, as the days wore on, Jason began to feel the pull of the outside world again. The whispers, the stares, the video that had gone viral, spreading like wildfire, making him the subject of cruel jokes, disgusting comments, and hateful ridicule. It didn't stop. It never stopped. He tried to ignore it, tried to distance himself from the voices in his head, but they crept in anyway. When he was walking through the neighborhood, he could hear it. Look at that kid. He's the one from the video. Or worse. They shouldn't let people like him near here. It wasn't just the people in the street anymore. It was the local news, the online forums. People everywhere had an opinion about him, and no matter how much he tried to block it out, he couldn't escape it. One afternoon, while walking home from the community center, Jason found himself passing the local coffee shop, where a group of teenagers often hung out. They were sitting outside, as usual, laughing and talking. As soon as he walked by, one of them caught sight of him and nudged the others. "Hey, it's that kid," the boy said, his voice loud enough for Jason to hear. "You know, the one who got kicked out of the mall. The one who's always causing trouble." Jason's stomach twisted, his heart pounding. He kept walking, trying to ignore them, but the words stung. They always did. "What's the matter, man? You gonna cry?" Another voice called out. Jason clenched his fists, his body tense with the urge to turn around, to say something, anything, to make them stop. But he knew better than to engage. He had learned the hard way that it would only make things worse. Still, the taunts followed him. Maybe we should take a video of him. You know, the poor little broken boy. Jason could feel their eyes on him, their mockery seeping into his skin like a poison. But it wasn't just them. It wasn't just these kids. It was everyone. His entire existence had become a spectacle, a joke, a cautionary tale for others to point at. That night, as Jason sat in his small, dimly lit room at the community center, he couldn't hold it in anymore. His fists slammed into the mattress, his face buried in the pillow, muffling the scream that tore through him. Everything he had tried to hold on to, everything he had tried to believe in, seemed so fragile, so pointless. Every inch of him felt like it was breaking. He couldn't do it. He couldn't keep pretending that it was going to get better. He had tried. He had tried so hard to fight back the crushing weight of it all. But the truth was, he couldn't escape it. He was trapped in a system that would never see him as anything other than a threat, a problem, a burden. Jason stood up abruptly, pacing the room, his mind racing. There was only one way to get the world's attention. There was only one way to make them see him. If they couldn't ignore him, if they couldn't dismiss him, maybe, just maybe, they would listen. The next day, Jason found himself at the mall again. It felt like a dark irony. Like the one place he had been rejected was now the only place he could go to be seen. The thought of it sickened him, but he couldn't stop himself. He needed them to see him. He needed them to know who he really was. When he entered the mall, the familiar sounds of the crowd swirled around him. But this time, it wasn't just the dull buzz of anonymous shoppers. It was a cacophony. People's eyes turned, their voices lowered, their phones raised. They knew him. They recognized him. He made his way to the food court, the place where it had all started, the place where he had been knocked down. But today, he wasn't walking with shame. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't just a nameless face to be ignored. He was going to make them see him. The guard from that day, the one who had thrown him out, was at his post. Jason saw him almost immediately. The man's eyes flicked over him, dismissing him at first, But when he saw that Jason wasn't backing down, the sneer on his face faded into something darker, something more dangerous. Jason didn't care. He walked past the guard, his heart thudding in his chest, until he reached the center of the food court. "Listen up!" Jason shouted, his voice echoing through the open space. People turned, surprised, confused, but Jason didn't care. He didn't care about the whispers, the judgment. He wasn't going to be silent anymore. "I'm not the kid you think I am. I'm not a joke. I'm not a threat. But you don't get to treat me like this. You don't get to look at me and see nothing but a problem. I'm a person. I have a name. I have a life, and I will not be silenced." The food court fell silent. The crowd stood still, some with phones already raised, some with their mouths open, shocked by the outburst. Jason's breath was heavy, his chest rising and falling with the intensity of his words. The anger he had kept bottled up for so long was now spilling out, uncontrolled. It was terrifying, liberating, raw. "I've been humiliated. I've been broken. But I am not your punching bag. I am not your entertainment. You don't get to tear me down just because you're afraid of what you don't understand." Jason's voice cracked, but he didn't stop. "You're scared of me because of how I look, because of where I'm from, because of the color of my skin. But I'm tired of letting you control my life. I'm done being a victim, and I'm done being invisible." The guards started to move toward him, but Jason stood his ground, facing him, eyes filled with fire. People in the crowd began to murmur, some shaking their heads, others nodding, starting to realize the weight of what Jason was saying. A few moments passed. Then, someone in the crowd began to clap. Slowly, others joined in, a quiet ripple spreading, as if just for a moment they saw him as more than just a face on a screen. Maybe they didn't understand him completely. Maybe they didn't know his pain. But for that brief moment, he wasn't invisible. He wasn't just the kid in the video. Jason took a deep breath, feeling the weight of it all. He knew this wouldn't fix everything. He knew it wouldn't erase the years of prejudice, of hate that he had lived with. But for the first time in a long time, he felt seen. He felt heard. And maybe that was enough for now. With one final glance at the crowd, Jason turned and walked out of the mall, his chest still tight, but his head held high. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he was ready to fight for himself. Jason woke up the next morning with a burning ache in his chest. The adrenaline from his outburst still pulsed in his veins, but the weight of the aftermath settled over him like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The faces from the mall lingered in his mind. The ones who had stared, the ones who had whispered, the ones who had filmed. He knew that what he had done would have consequences, but nothing prepared him for what came next. When he stepped out into the street, the reality hit him. It wasn't just the crowd at the mall. It wasn't just the few who had mocked him in person. It was the whole world, watching through the lens of social media. By now, the video had spread to thousands of people, and the comments were relentless. Jason's name was being tossed around the internet, twisted and warped into something unrecognizable. The world had made its judgment. "You've seen him. He's the one who threw a tantrum at the mall. What a joke. Always the same, always looking for attention, just like all of them. The world doesn't need more people like him." These were the comments that Jason saw when he reluctantly checked his phone that morning. The same words he had been hearing for days, but now they were louder, more intense, and more personal. He wasn't just the target of a few people at the mall anymore. He was the subject of a viral spectacle, a symbol of everything people were afraid of. He was the angry black teenager, the threat, the stereotype that everyone had been waiting to see fall. The moment Jason stepped outside, he could feel the weight of it all. Eyes followed him everywhere he went, some with fear, others with disdain, and even a few with open hostility. People didn't just stare anymore. They pointed. They muttered. They made their judgments. He was no longer invisible, but the attention he received was nothing like what he had hoped for. The world didn't want to see him as a person. They wanted to see him as a problem. And nothing he did could change that. He made his way to the community center, the only place that still felt like a refuge, though even that had started to feel different. The regulars who had been so kind to him now looked at him with a mix of sympathy and concern. They didn't know how to deal with him anymore. They didn't know how to help him fight this battle. Marcus was the first to greet him when he entered, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. He didn't offer any platitudes. He didn't try to tell Jason that everything would be okay. He just nodded, his gaze steady. "I know it's hard," he said softly, "but you're not alone in this." Jason sat down, staring at the floor. His mind was spinning, his emotions raw and tangled. "I don't know what to do," he muttered, his voice hoarse. I tried to stand up for myself, but all it's done is make things worse. People are calling me a joke. They're calling me a threat. They think I'm just trying to get attention." Marcus sat down beside him, his voice steady. "That's what they want you to think. They want to keep you down, make you believe that you don't have a right to be angry. But your anger is real. It's justified. And it's something that can drive change, if you know how to use it." Jason shook his head. "I don't know how. I'm just tired of being treated like I don't matter, like I don't belong." "You do belong," Marcus said firmly, "but you have to fight for it. No one is going to give it to you. You have to make them see you, not just as a problem, not just as a stereotype, but as a human being." Jason's mind was reeling. "I don't know how much more of this I can take. I've been kicked out of places. I've been humiliated. People treat me like I'm nothing." Marcus put a hand on his shoulder. "The fight is never easy. It never was. But what you do now, the way you respond, is what will define you. You don't have to fight it all at once, but you can start by refusing to be silent. Start by showing them that you're not afraid. You're stronger than they think." Jason nodded, though the weight of his words didn't fully sink in. The truth was, he wasn't sure how much longer he could stand to be in the spotlight, to face the vitriol and hate that had followed him ever since the video had gone viral. Every day felt like another battle he wasn't sure he could win. And now, it wasn't just the people in the streets or at the mall. It was the system, the institutions. They were all aligned against him. That evening, Jason couldn't escape the pull of his phone. The notification came through again. New video. Jason's rant at the mall. He didn't want to look. He didn't want to see himself again. Didn't want to hear the echo of his own voice. But his hand moved without thinking, tapping the notification. The video was a montage. Clips from his outburst, edited together with shots of people's reactions. The headline was clear. Outrageous rant in the mall. Teen causes chaos and provokes violence. The footage was framed in a way that distorted the truth, making Jason look like a loose cannon, an unhinged teenager who had thrown a tantrum for attention. The comments were even worse than before. Typical. This kid needs to be put in his place. Can't stand these angry people thinking they can just do whatever they want. He's not a victim. He's just a troublemaker. He deserves what's coming to him. Jason's heart pounded in his chest. He closed the phone, his hands shaking. He couldn't take it anymore. They were right. They were all right. He was just a joke, a nuisance. No matter how hard he fought, he would never be seen as more than that. But Marcus's words echoed in his head. "You're stronger than they think." Jason took a deep breath and opened the phone again. He couldn't let this define him. He couldn't let them control his narrative. He had to do something. Jason sat down at the community center the next day and began writing. He wrote about his experience, about the rage he felt, about the pain of being seen as less than human, of being reduced to a stereotype. It was a story he had to tell, a story that needed to be heard. He wasn't just writing to vent. He was writing to make people listen. When he finished, he posted it online, unfiltered and raw. It wasn't just an apology. It wasn't just an explanation. It was his truth, and he was going to make them listen. The next morning, the backlash was immediate. People flooded the comments, some agreeing with him, some defending him, but most of them still clinging to the same narrative that had been pushed from the start. But this time, something was different. This time, Jason wasn't backing down. He was standing tall, refusing to be the punchline of their joke. And slowly, over the course of the next few days, something started to shift. People began to share his story, Not just the video, not just the sensationalized headlines, but his words, his truth. There were still plenty of people who mocked him, who dehumanized him. But there were others who were starting to see him for what he was. A person, not a stereotype. A person with a voice that deserved to be heard. Jason didn't know where this would lead. He didn't know how far his voice would reach. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was finally taking control of his own narrative. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Jason could feel it in the air. Things were shifting, though he wasn't sure if it was for better or worse. After his post went live, something unexpected happened. The backlash was louder, more vicious. But there was also a strange ripple of support that started to spread through the very people who had once laughed at him, mocked him, and dismissed him as nothing more than a nuisance. It wasn't much, a few comments, a handful of shares, a couple of people asking questions, but it was a start. Jason didn't know if it was enough to change the narrative. Hell, he didn't know if he even cared anymore. He was tired. So tired of fighting to be seen. The world had already decided who he was. They had labeled him. And that label, once slapped on, was harder to peel off than any bruise. He spent the next few days holed up at the community center, trying to ignore the endless stream of notifications and the constant barrage of messages that flooded his phone. The comments on his post were a mixture of vitriol and begrudging acknowledgement, but one message stood out from the rest. It was from someone he didn't know, someone who seemed to see past all the noise. I see you, and I hear you. That was it, simple, yet profound. It wasn't an apology or an attempt to make things right. It wasn't an offer of help. It was just a statement of recognition. And for the first time in what felt like ages, Jason allowed himself to believe it. Maybe there were people out there who were starting to get it. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't completely alone. But as much as the message had given him a glimmer of hope, he knew the fight wasn't over. He had only just begun to scratch the surface. The next day, Jason went to the local library to get away from the noise, to find a moment of peace where he could think. The air outside was crisp, and for the first time in a long while, the sun felt warm on his skin. But even the fresh air couldn't shake the weight of what he had to face. When he entered the library, the familiar scent of old books and paper hit him. He was relieved to be in a place where the world felt quieter, where people were too absorbed in their own worlds to care about the color of his skin or the label society had tried to pin on him. He made his way to the back, to a secluded corner where he could sit and think without being stared at. But just as he was about to pull out his notebook, a voice interrupted him. "You're that kid, right? The one from the mall?" Jason's blood ran cold. He turned slowly, finding a woman standing a few feet away. She was dressed in business attire, her face sharp and serious. She wasn't smiling, and there was no warmth in her gaze, just a cold, calculating look that made his stomach churn. "I saw your video," she continued, her tone dismissive. Quite the outburst. Not very professional, was it? Jason's heart pounded in his chest. He had hoped for a moment of peace, of refuge, but instead, he was being attacked again. He had expected it, but it still stung. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. What could he say? "I'm just here to get some peace and quiet," Jason muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman took a step closer. "Do you really think people are going to respect you if you keep acting out like this? You're making it worse for yourself." She paused, and her gaze flicked over him as if she were inspecting a piece of trash. "People like you know, they get what they deserve." Jason felt the heat rising in his chest, the anger building up again. He wanted to say something, to throw it back in her face, but he knew better. She wasn't worth it. She wasn't worth the effort. But it didn't stop the burning shame that gnawed at his insides. It didn't stop the feeling that he was constantly being reminded that he was less than everyone else, that he was a burden, that, no matter how loud he screamed, he would always be silenced by the weight of their hatred. The woman turned to leave, but not before adding one last, cutting remark. "If you really want to get ahead, maybe try acting like you belong. Stop making it so easy for them to treat you like this." Jason stood frozen, the words echoing in his ears, long after she had walked away. He wanted to chase after her, to shout at her, to tell her how wrong she was. But he didn't. Instead, he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The world wasn't going to change because he yelled at it. It wasn't going to change because he begged for its approval. He wasn't going to win this fight with anger, but maybe, just maybe, he could win it with something else. For the next few days, Jason kept to himself, trying to sort through the mess in his mind. The video, the ridicule, the constant reminders of his place in this world. It was all wearing him down. But there was a fire inside him, a fire that hadn't been completely extinguished. It flickered, weakly at first, but it was still there. One evening, as Jason walked through the streets of his neighborhood, he noticed a group of kids standing on the corner, whispering and pointing. They were looking at him, but instead of the usual sneers or hostile glares, their faces showed something different. Curiosity. Jason didn't know what to make of it at first. He kept walking, but one of the kids called out to him, "Yo man, you're the one from the mall, right? The one who stood up and said something." Jason stopped in his tracks, his heart skipping a beat. "Yeah," he said cautiously. "Look, I saw that video, man," the kid continued. "I didn't get it at first, but damn, you were right. You shouldn't have been treated like that. People need to hear what you said." Jason's mind was spinning. It wasn't much. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't going to change everything. But it was something. It was the first time someone had acknowledged him in a way that didn't reduce him to the angry, ungrateful teenager that everyone else saw. "You know, it's not right what they did to you," the kid said. "I mean, I'm not saying I'd go off like you did, but I get it. People should listen." For the first time in days, Jason allowed himself to smile. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as invisible as he thought. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. But even as the words echoed in his mind, he knew that the fight was far from over. The world would keep trying to break him. It would keep reminding him of his place, keep labeling him as something less. But for the first time, Jason felt like he had a voice. He had something to say, and he was done letting the world decide who he was. He was going to make them listen. Jason stood at the edge of the crowd, his heart racing, his breath shallow. The mall, the place that had marked the lowest point of his life, now felt like the epicenter of his reckoning. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his jacket, the familiar weight of it a reminder of the battle he was still fighting. A crowd had gathered around the mall entrance, drawn in by the whispers, the rumors, and the unfolding drama of the past few weeks. They came with cameras in hand, eager to catch whatever was about to happen next. It had taken him weeks to get here, weeks of quiet reflection, of building up his strength. Marcus's words still echoed in his mind. "You're stronger than they think." Jason had tried to believe it, even as he fought the constant onslaught of racism, hatred, and mockery. But now, he knew that the only way forward was to face them head on. He had to stand in front of the world and show them who he really was. Not just some viral video, not just some angry teenager, but a person, a human being. The guards at the mall were the first to see him. They had been following the news, following his every move, waiting for him to slip, waiting for him to back down. But Jason didn't plan on slipping. Not today. The tension in the air was thick, the kind of pressure that you could feel on your skin, like a storm was about to break. He could hear the murmurs of the crowd, their eyes trained on him. Some of them were hostile, others were just curious, and a few seemed to understand, or at least were willing to listen. He took a deep breath. He could feel the weight of their expectations pressing in on him, but he wasn't going to let it crush him this time. He stepped forward, the clicking of his shoes echoing across the open space, and the mall guards shifted, standing a little taller, as if preparing for a confrontation. But Jason didn't come for a fight, not in the way they expected. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Jason said, his voice steady. The crowd fell silent, the tension now palpable in the air. "I'm not here to make a scene. I'm here because you all need to hear something." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The power was in his words, in the quiet authority that had been building inside him for weeks, months, maybe even years. He knew the world had been trying to silence him, had been trying to convince him that his anger, his pain, his very existence wasn't worthy of respect. But he wasn't letting them do that anymore. "You saw that video," Jason continued, his eyes scanning the crowd. He could feel the eyes of the guards on him, the weight of their disdain, but he didn't flinch. "You saw the way I was treated, the way I was thrown out, humiliated. You saw how they treated me like I was nothing, like I didn't matter." The crowd remained silent, listening. "And for the record," Jason added, his voice a little sharper now, "I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask to be the face of a problem, but that's what they made me. That's what they want me to be. A problem to be ignored, a problem to be dismissed." He paused, the words hanging heavy in the air. "But I'm not a problem. I'm a person." There was a shift in the crowd. Some of the people who had been filming paused. Others leaned in, their eyes narrowing with thought. "I don't want your pity," Jason said, his tone firm now. "I don't want your sympathy. I don't want to be a headline or a hashtag. I want to be seen for who I am, not the color of my skin, not the clothes I wear, but for the person I am." He paused again, letting the weight of his words settle in. "You all think you know me, but you don't. You don't know the pain I've felt, the way this world has treated me. You don't know what it's like to be looked at as nothing, to be told you don't belong, to have your worth reduced to a stereotype. I've been beaten down, dragged through the mud, and told I'm nothing. But I'm still standing here." Jason looked directly at the guards, his eyes locking with theirs, his gaze unwavering. "You think you've won. You think that by throwing me out, by humiliating me, by making me small, you've done something. But you haven't. You haven't broken me. I'm still here. I'm still standing." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Jason could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, some still skeptical, others intrigued. But something had shifted. He could feel it. The atmosphere had changed. For the first time, he wasn't just speaking to the people in the crowd. He was speaking to everyone who had ever judged him, who had ever looked at him and seen only the color of his skin, the way he walked, the way he dressed. "I am not your enemy," Jason said quietly, but the power in his voice made it ring out. "I am not a threat. I am not some wild animal you need to control. I am just a kid, a person. And I deserve the same respect as everyone else, the same dignity, the same chance to live without being judged before I even open my mouth." He paused, his chest heaving with the effort of holding himself together. His heart was racing, his hands still trembling, but the fear was fading. He had done it. He had said it. And now all he could do was wait for the world to respond. The guards were still standing there, silent, their eyes darting around, unsure of how to react. The crowd was still quiet, but Jason could feel the shift. It was subtle, but it was there. A few people in the back nodded. A few others murmured in agreement. And then someone clapped. It was a single clap at first, soft and uncertain. But then another person joined in. And another. Soon the sound of clapping filled the air, and Jason felt the weight of it on his shoulders. But this time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like something else, like recognition, like validation. The guards, still unsure, took a step back. Jason stood taller, his shoulders squared, the fire in his chest not yet extinguished. For the first time, he felt like he was in control. "Thank you," Jason said quietly, the words almost lost in the noise of the clapping. "But I'm not done yet." The crowd quieted, the sound of applause still lingering in the air. Jason took a step back, letting the words hang in the silence between them. He knew that this wasn't the end. He knew the fight wasn't over. But he also knew something else. He knew that, for the first time, the world had seen him. They had heard him. And no matter what happened next, he had made his mark. And that, he realized, was enough. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. What did you think about Jason's journey? Have you experienced moments of racism in your own life? Or have you witnessed similar struggles? Your thoughts and stories are incredibly important to us. We value each and every one of you, and your perspective means a lot. If you enjoyed the story, Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We really appreciate your support. Wishing you all a wonderful day ahead. And if you've listened to this story all the way through, leave a comment with the phrase, "I am more than a stereotype," so we know you've made it to the end.